I, like you, I'm slightly puzzled. You write in the piece that you're not quite sure what their aims are exactly, because I actually had a guy called Gary McFarlane on, who's part of their organisation here in the UK, and I said to him, at what point do you stop marching? Because at what point do you realise that you've achieved whatever it is that you want to achieve? And he said, well, we'll never stop. We will never stop. And I'm like, well, okay, but what are you trying to achieve? And he couldn't really answer.
Well, the way I end that column is when you think about, for example, somebody denied a promotion because of the colour of their skin, or somebody who doesn't get a job interview, or somebody living without hope in a tower block. To what extent are their lives materially improved by deleting a scene from Fawlty Towers circa 1978? Yeah. And if the answer is not at all, then the energy, the righteous energy, should be directed towards those substantive changes to the law, to institutional structure that can make a difference. Otherwise, it just becomes a kind of symbolism.
Exactly.
And I don't like that at all. And I think it would be a great waste and squandering of this great energy that has built up. And I think that would be a tremendous opportunity missed.
Yes, but I think, unfortunately and tragically, the bulk of any movement is made up of followers rather than leaders. And I think the people who follow are rather like those three teenagers that you heard talking about a statue which they knew nothing about. And you would have thought in this day and age that one of them would have gotten their iPhone and just Googled him to see who he was.
Yeah,
because,
quite.
that is actually one of the easiest things that you can now do. When, for example, Tower Hamlets Council moved some guy called Milligan from East India Dock, I said, well, surely he's there. Yes, he was connected to the slave trade. He had some kind of plantation in Jamaica, but he also created Docklands, effectively, and that's why there was a statue to him. I'd never heard of him. I didn't know who he was. I don't know why he was there, but I assume he was significant. Yeah. So therefore you have a statue built to you at that time because you're significant. And why get rid of that when actually you could look at it, learn from it, find out what it was that he did, find out what it was that you didn't like that he did, and then move on.
And one of the things about the really successful political movements is they tend to mobilise what you might call moderate opinion. I mean, that was Martin Luther King's genius in the 1960s, those peaceful protests, the overreaction of some of the police forces in the South, the dawning realisation that even in the metropolitan cities of the North there had been terrible discrimination in housing, in employment, very easy to identify once you put your finger on it. That began to mobilise public opinion. I also think that, Lyndon Johnson went much further than I think Congress would have imagined possible, even a year earlier when he signed into law the 1964 Civil Rights Act, then of course the 1965 Voting Rights Acts. And that was because he could see that the Democratic Party needed that middle opinion. And I worry that this movement is beginning to alienate that opinion.
Yes.
Tell you one of the other things, you'll have seen this, is that obviously the demographic on Twitter is not representative of the wider population.
It's tempting to think that it is.
It's very tempting. This happens in politics. It happens in sports journalism a lot, by the way, where people go and have a look on Twitter and what people are and then you begin to think, well, I'll write a column in line with what Twitter. But Twitter, if you, I often try and think of it this way, it's like the amygdala, that part of the brain that slightly overreacts to stuff.
Right.
The one that the fight, flight, freeze response.
Yes.
And I think Twitter's like the nation's amygdala, and it's much better to take a step back and use the prefrontal cortex.
Right. Which, of course, is complete anathema to Twitter because that's not what you're supposed to do.
Exactly.
You're supposed to react immediately and with some vigour and preferably with a lot of anger.
Well, and I mean, just to use a few examples from sport. So one of the things that I've found very interesting is there will be an allegation against a particular public figure. So it might be Sam Allardyce, front page of the Telegraph. He has been promising to go and do speeches in the Middle East in defiance of his contract.
Right.
Twitter immediately will say, resign, be sacked, get rid of this.
Well, that's the only thing they know what to do.
And then, of course, you say, well, what about due process?
Right.
What about this person's right of reply? What about the possibility that these are edited highlights?
Well, how about you actually read the story in full before you react to it?
Well, quite. The same happened with Lord Treesman and David Moyes, and fast forwarding to Mark Sampson. And just asking Twitter to take a step back. In each of these cases, people have complained at me personally that because I defended Mark Sampson, who had been accused of racism, I hate racism, but I also think that he should have an opportunity to defend his name with an independent tribunal, not mob rule. Well, you're defending a racist. But of course you're not defending a racist. Yeah. You're defending due process.
Right. But also there's this other ridiculous kind of comparison business that seems to go on in Twitter all the time, where they say, well, if you think that, what about this? Well, why do you not say to condemn this man if you're condemning this guy? Or if you're allowing this man off what he did, why are you condemning the other guy that you wrote about last week? There seems to be no logic to it at all. And I mean, I don't think the answer is to shut down Twitter or to tell people not to use social media. Because it's a fascinating kind of addition to me, anyway, to what we do in the media. I don't think I'd want to be on it if I wasn't in the media, because it would be just too ridiculous. But, it is remarkable how we have given opinion to people who, and I dare say this will not be welcomed by some of the people I'm listening to, who are listening to us, who shouldn't actually have an opinion, because they haven't thought about that opinion. And it's dangerous if you give an opinion without thinking about it.
But what one hoped would happen with Twitter is it would lead to a higher flow of information. So if you imagine 40 years ago, most people consumed the news through the BBC, which has a monolithic view of the world, or certainly did then, to a certain extent does now, and at most one newspaper. So they really were not surrounded by opinions that contradicted their own worldview. One hoped that the internet would lead to a situation where people would be able to hear the views and perspectives of others, and therefore come to more nuanced and complex views of their own. What I think has happened is it has metastasized into different echo chambers, where people are prepared to retweet those with whom they have a tribal or ideological allegiance.
Yes, and with whom they agree on everything.
Right, and then instantly repudiate other people without actually looking at the evidence that the other person is seeking to corroborate their opinion. And so you get this, it's almost like the repelling of alternative views. And I think it would be a really progressive thing if people on Twitter were prepared to give those with whom they disagree the benefit of the doubt, to read what they're saying, look at the evidence of what they're saying, and who knows, come to some kind of a rapprochement with them.
Absolutely. We're going to take a little break in a moment, but I'll just tell you this little story. I was in newspapers for a long time before I went into radio, and when I was in newspapers before social media, it was still more or less the main sort of source of information that people got. And there was no internet. You couldn't check what was happening in Japan at 3:00 in the afternoon. And funnily enough, my 13-year-old son and I watched, this will make you laugh, Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, which is an old Cary Grant movie, right from the 40s.
Yes, right.
And at one point, he wakes up in the morning in his apartment in New York, and he goes to the front door in his dressing gown, and he gets the newspaper. And I said to my son, I said, at that moment, this is when he finds out what happened yesterday. And before that, he didn't know what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And he looked at me like, he said, what? I said, you can't imagine that was the only means of finding out what was going on. Because even then, there wasn't really television. And I think that we do have this overload now. And when I was in newspapers, we were kind of the filter. And some people might have said, well, we were the wrong kind of filter, and why should I be the filter? Why should I be telling you what you need to know about? But that was our job. And now there is no filter, so nobody really knows. It takes us into fake news. It takes us into the wrong kind of news, the wrong kind of opinion, and it's very dangerous.
And it's actually quite a deep problem, because if you think about it, even a scientist, we should know this more post-COVID, takes other scientists' outputs as inputs for their deliberation. In other words, information is underpinned by a very complicated social structure of trust. If you don't trust anybody, we can't check things from first principles, like nuclear fission or macroeconomic policy. We trust people, we read what they say, and we take their outputs as inputs for what we think about the world. When that trust begins to break down, and I think we're in danger of that at the moment.
Well, people have never mistrusted the media more, I don't think.
Right, but not just the media. I think there is now a certain mistrust of science itself. Conspiracy theories are appearing much more on the internet than we've always had a predisposition to buy into conspiracy theories as a species, but I think that's happening more and more. And I do think that, this is obviously a very big question, but repairing some level of trust within society is important, not just for the media, not just important for democratic politics, but for science itself.
Yes, I think that's right. So Keir Starmer, I think, has done everybody a favour by delineating the difference between Black Lives Matter as an organisation and Black Lives Matter as a sort of a moment, as he described it. I thought that was interesting, because it now means that you can say the moment may have passed. But the Premier League, who were very hasty in sort of embracing Black Lives Matter as an organisation, have also now had to distance themselves from it. And it does prove, does it not, that sport and politics really doesn't mix terribly well.
I was worried when I looked at the Black Lives Matter UK website, and it talked about such things as dismantling capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, that sounded to me like an agenda that goes far beyond the idea of racial equality.
Well, exactly.
One can talk about racial equality, about the dignity of all people, everyone being deserving a fair chance, without talking about the destruction of capitalism, which in my view has been the engine of economic growth that has helped all races and all society. I mean, some more than others, obviously, and I'd like to see that more evenly distributed, but nevertheless a great engine for progress. So you're right to draw, I think Starmer's right to draw a distinction between these two. By the way, I think Starmer, for what it's worth, I stood for the Labour Party in 2001 at a general election against John Redwood in Wokingham, the Vulcan.
The Vulcan.
I don't know how many people remember him.
Yes. Well, he's still here. He's still around. He's still going.
Well, he probably has an eternal life. I don't know what the Vulcan's mortality is, but I was quite proud to stand for Labour in 2001, and I felt that I thought Ed Miliband took it too far to the left.
Yes.
And then Corbyn crazily too far to the left. And I think it's not impossible, for what it's worth, that Starmer, by getting rid of Rebecca Long-Bailey, drawing this distinction between Black Lives Matter, the political organisation,
which hasn't made him popular with the left in Labour.
I agree, but that absolutely shows that he's on track. Both of those things made him unpopular with the hard left and very popular with the middle English voters he needs to construct a coalition for the next election. I mean, I think he could be very good, and certainly very good for democracy. I think a proper challenger to
I think it's good that he's suddenly somebody now that can be worth watching on Provence's questions, because it had become, when Theresa May was up against Jeremy Corbyn, we actually stopped covering it. It was that boring, you know. Then when Corbyn was up against Boris, we kind of knew what was happening. This, I mean, I don't find Keir Starmer at all interesting. I disagree with those who say that he's this forensic, brilliant lawyer. I don't think he is, because all of the stuff that he did say about Black Lives Matter this week, he should have known before he went on the knee with Angela Rayner.
Yeah, I think his method of speaking, the way he conducts himself in television and radio interviews, he's not the warmest person. And I think that does help in terms of political appeal. He can perhaps work on that. Margaret Thatcher struggled desperately after she got the Conservative leadership.
I mean, I suppose from his point of view, there's no point in trying to out-charisma Boris Johnson.
True. Yeah, that's true. Maybe the contrast is a sensible thing. Yeah. But one thing, I'm not sure I've ever said this publicly, but one of the things that alienated me from the Labour Party, I was sort of seeking selection sometime after 2010, and I was asked if I had a second home. Do you remember there was all that stuff about second homes? Well, I ought to say I went to a comprehensive school, and I hope I've worked pretty hard. I was a ping pong player before going.
You were quite a good ping pong player, to be fair.
Wasn't a bad ping pong player. We prefer to call it table tennis, but
nevertheless. I think you might have. Do you know, I used to be quite good at it. I shouldn't say it to you. Well, I used to play with the Chinese pen grip, and occasionally I'd flip it over and surprise people with a regular backhand.
Well, that's very difficult to do. Although you're a single handicapper golfer.
Well, true.
Look, I was talking about my sport there. We sort of transition. But so I actually, had invested the money that I had made, and I was very proud of having done so.
And why not?
In property.
Yes.
So I mentioned that I had not just a second property, but more than that. And I was told, well, you better keep that quiet, because you will never win a selection, a parliamentary selection for the Labour Party. And I got home and I told my wife, who also went to a comprehensive school, worked very hard, went to Oxford and has been successful. I think that should be celebrated.
Sure.
We should be giving other people opportunities to go on that path. I mean, I should say my parents were probably the main reason for this, not me. I was horrified at the contempt that the party had for ambition, for success, for drive and aspiration. And I think that the acid test for Starmer, if you look back at general elections, the one that is the politicians that win are those that connect their platform with the idea of aspiration, self-reliance, those attributes that I think all people believe in.
And I don't think he's there yet, but he's got a long way to go. And I think Boris Johnson has got quite a long way to go now as well, in terms of returning to normal politics, because, we are coming out of the coronavirus. He is setting out a new plan, and we'll see how that goes.